On April 14, the Athletic FC announced that New Jersey Transit was planning on charging riders $100 for a round-trip ticket from Midtown Manhattan to MetLife Stadium for the 2026 World Cup. That's more expensive than the average price of a last-minute Amtrak ticket from New York City to Philadelphia. And the trip to MetLife Stadium? It's only 11 miles. New Jersey Governor Mikey Sherrill has since addressed the issue and doubled down on the pricing, claiming that New Jerseyans should not have to foot the $48 million bill NJT is expected to pay for getting fans to and from the stadium. The price was then officially announced as $150 in mid-April, with NJT President Chris Kaluri defending the price as a necessity to cover increased security costs. However, pricing tickets at such extremes counters the function of public transit, which is a public service, not a luxury. All over the internet, people have expressed their outrage with this decision, calling it price gouging and viewing it as just another way America is trying to milk as much money as they can from the tournament. The backlash did get NJT to reduce their fares, first to $105 and then down to $98 using corporate sponsors. But this massive price increase is a symptom of a far greater issue with how America views public transportation, especially trains. Well, isn't America the land of the automobile? Why is this a problem when you can just drive? Apart from the fact that taking public transportation to events like this should always be prioritized over driving, FIFA has reduced existing parking for fan zones and security. Also, many international visitors won't necessarily be renting cars, so this means that they will rely on public transportation to get to the games. Something easier said than done in a country that destroyed its public transportation and forced car dependency upon its population. So why not just walk? While theoretically possible, the practicality of walking is not what you would think. If we look at the 11 stadiums in the US that will host matches, we notice a common trait. Most of them are in a sea of parking and are quite far from their respective city centers. 7 of them do have connections to some form of rail transit, but the remainders do not. And reaching these stadiums on foot doesn't mean a longer walk on normal sidewalks. It means navigating the hellscape of stroads and SUV traffic that is American suburbia. Coming back to MetLife Stadium, it is located 6 miles west of Times Square. While not too far away, the large Hudson River does lie between them, and the stadium itself is within the New Jersey Meadowlands, making walking not a practical option. MetLife Stadium does have a decent rail connection to New York City, Newark, or New Jersey, so finding an alternative to driving to the stadium will be relatively easy. Affording it, on the other hand, might be a problem. So why is NJT charging $98 for something that normally costs just under $13? You'd be forgiven for thinking it's greed, but it's actually desperation. And to explain where this desperation comes from, I need to give a brief overview with how commuter railroads work in the United States. The problem can be summed up with something that I call the triple Fs: fragmentation, funding, and function. The United States has an unusual relationship with railroads. Despite having the largest rail network in the world by far, only a fraction of it is used for passenger rail. At one time, trains were as American as apple pie and baseball. Private railroads operated extensive networks across the country, but as automobiles became more popular and massive federal investment flowed into highways, passenger rail service declined rapidly. Since American railroads were owned by private, profit-driven companies, they did not want to keep operating money-losing passenger trains. This culminated in 1971, with the federal government stepping in and taking over operation of these unprofitable passenger trains through Amtrak. But the tracks themselves overwhelmingly remained under the control of private enterprises. On a regional scope, the aftermath of this reorganization left a patchwork of commuter and regional railroads operated by their local state or city governments, each with their own priorities and constraints. Rail agencies in the Northeast were mostly able to acquire ownership of the underlying infrastructure, while others, such as Chicago's Metra or Los Angeles' Metrolink, run their trains on tracks owned primarily by private freight railroads. And this fragmentation makes coordination difficult. Planning service or upgrading infrastructure tends to require coordination between agencies and sometimes private companies. Nowhere else in the U.S. is this more apparent than in the New York tri-state area. Despite functioning as a single metropolitan area, transit is divided across multiple state-level agencies, the largest of them being the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and New Jersey Transit. Even on single lines, ownership is divided. For example, here's the 95-mile-long route from Hoboken Terminal to Port Jervis. Hoboken to Suffern is owned and operated by New Jersey Transit itself, while the route north of Suffern to Port Jervis is owned by the private Norfolk Southern Corporation, but leased to the Metro-North Railroad, which is owned by the MTA. New Jersey Transit operates trains between Suffern and Port Jervis under an agreement with Metro-North. On top of this, the central route through New York City, the Northeast Corridor, is owned by Amtrak, requiring commuter railroads to coordinate. Despite being fragmented, route ownership can always be negotiated. A larger problem with this fragmentation is infrastructure. It is not only apparent by track ownership, but also by electrification. New York's electrified railways were mostly done by 4 railroad companies: the Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central Railroad, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Following the bankruptcies and federal reorganizations of the 1960s and 70s, this left newly created transit agencies a multitude of legacy electrification they would need to coordinate their trains within. Never mind voltage, New York area railroads use 2 entirely different electrification systems. You have your third rail systems on the electrified portion of the Long Island Railroad as well as Metro-North's Harlem and Hudson lines, and you have your overhead wire electrification for Metro-North's New Haven line as well as New Jersey Transit's electrified lines. This means that each railroad needs to operate equipment that can run on their respective electrified routes, making interchangeable service difficult. Even within systems, different voltages are used, further requiring trains to be equipped with multi-voltage and even dual-mode equipment. For example, while the Northeast Corridor is fully electrified with overhead wire, it does not operate under a single voltage. This is the consequence of the legacy systems built by defunct private railroads, where a unified network around New York City was not within their interests. Passenger rail serving the tri-state area still has the major advantage of owning the majority of the infrastructure, but they are still split amongst agencies subservient to their state or federal governments. While agreements help overcome the bureaucratic side, physical infrastructure still remains an obstacle for streamlined service. And that brings us to the next F, and perhaps the most dreaded of the triple Fs: funding. If there is one key word to describe American passenger rail in the late 20th and early 21st century, it is underfunded. Unlike in Europe, where it is considered a public service, American transit agencies are expected to recover a significant portion of their operating costs directly from riders. A well-known example of this is Amtrak, where funding has long been inconsistent and regularly contested at the federal level. This dynamic also applies to regional agencies such as New Jersey Transit. Since NJT heavily depends on fare revenue to sustain operation, if ridership drops or operating costs suddenly increase, it doesn't have a lot of funding to fall back on. Raising or adding taxes could result in negative political consequences, so raising fares is one of the limited, safe options they have. In the recent debate for the 2025 New Jersey gubernatorial elections, Republican candidate Jack Ciattarelli sums up this philosophy.
The specific question was regarding New Jersey Transit. Here's what we need to do. Every single train and bus line needs to be reevaluated for ridership. If there isn't adequate ridership on every one of those lines, we have a tough decision to make. I do think we should dedicate our limited resources to those lines that provide the greatest value to the greatest number of commuters.
This is an antiquated ideology that forces public transit to be revenue-oriented, when in reality it should function as a public service, no different from our roads. This ideology is widespread in the U.S. and unfortunately reflected by lawmakers. Agencies are expected to show proper ridership on lines or face funding cuts, which inevitably lead to service cuts. And this can bring forth real crises, such as the SEPTA funding crisis in 2025, which nearly led to widespread cuts of bus and rail service throughout the Philadelphia metro area. And this happened on a system that operates the 6th busiest commuter rail network in the United States. And this can lead to fatal feedback loops. Lack of funding leads to service cuts, which leads to lower ridership, which leads to lack of funding, and so on. And while certain governments can be net positives for public transit, since it is not viewed as a public service to the extent that roads or utilities are, securing long-term funding for large projects or services can be difficult. The state or federal office can change at any election, and this can negatively affect funding or the budget of transit agencies and projects. If projects go over budget, which they tend to do, the next administration could simply reduce funding or outright cancel it. Perhaps the most infuriating thing to hear when it comes to public transit is, how will we pay for it? This being said, while blowing over $100 billion on an offensive and wildly unpopular war with Iran proves that quote to be utter bullshit. The triple F problem is the systematic background that manufactures the need for these $98 tickets. So now let's take a look at New Jersey Transit itself. New Jersey Transit operates commuter rail, light rail, and bus service across the state of New Jersey. This is New Jersey Transit's commuter rail system. With the exception of the Atlantic City line, all routes are centered around Hoboken Terminal in Jersey City or Penn Station in Manhattan. Together with the Long Island and Metro-North railroads, these three systems make up the commuter and regional rail network serving New York City. In terms of ownership, here's what NJT actually owns. Once again, by American commuter rail standards, this is a pretty good ownership ratio, but it is still part of a wider, fragmented system. New Jersey Transit's busiest route, the Northeast Corridor line, and its access to Penn Station is owned by Amtrak, meaning that NJT must coordinate and pay to operate nearly 700 daily train movements to and from Manhattan. The connection to MetLife Stadium is facilitated through a short spur off the Pascack Valley line, which in turn originates out of Hoboken Terminal. The connection to New York City is via a transfer at Secaucus Junction, where passengers from Penn Station, or other parts of New Jersey, can transfer to trains to the Meadowlands. Remember how I mentioned electrification being an obstacle? Here's why. Between 2009 and 2017, an agreement between New Jersey Transit, Amtrak, and Metro-North saw the creation of a direct rail service from New Haven, Connecticut to the Meadowlands, known as the Train to the Game. These special trains would allow passengers easy access to Secaucus Junction, where they could transfer the trains to MetLife Stadium for NFL football games. However, Metro-North couldn't contribute any of its equipment, since its M8 train sets cannot run on the Pennsylvania Railroad-built electrification system. This forced NJT to supply all train equipment because its locomotives could operate on both electrified networks. This, however, limited service to games with a kickoff time of 1 p.m., done so to allow NJT to return its equipment to facilitate the Monday morning rush, meaning that service to late or primetime games were not offered. Had the infrastructure been a more uniform system, trains running this service could be pooled from multiple agencies instead of only from one. And this is where the Triple Fs rear their ugly heads. Fragmentation means that NJT must operate the service itself without the guarantee of interoperability and still pay Amtrak for access to Penn Station. Funding means the organization must cover increased costs with little outside help, and function means the state of New Jersey prioritizes its fare box over the greater public good. According to Governor Sherrill, these reduced fares were only possible due to advertising partnerships. While this is a solution, it is solving a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. And tickets still remain at $98, over 7 times the normal price. To be clear, this isn't just a New Jersey Transit problem, nor am I solely blaming Governor Sherrill for her decision. This is a result of the broader systematic issue with how policymakers view public transit in the United States. Now let's compare this with Europe. Germany, with the largest European national rail network at nearly 40,000 kilometers, has Deutsche Bahn as its national railway operator. While several semi-private and private operators also run trains in the country, the physical infrastructure they run on is mostly owned by one state organization, Deutsche Bahn Infrago. German railroad philosophy is even reflected in the name. GO stands for Gemeinwohl orientiert, which translates to oriented towards public interest. When it comes to train operators, Deutsche Bahn has several subsidiaries and state-funded organizations. However, since the majority of the German rail network is operated by the same organization, operators have a much more straightforward path when it comes to planning and coordinating service. So whether the train is an intercity express service from Berlin to Cologne, a regional train from Wuppertal to Bonn, or even a privately operated Flix train from Hamburg to Leipzig, they all operate on a nationalized infrastructure network. And for local and regional transportation, Germany has integrated regional networks that allow unified ticket sales for all forms of transit within the area. This can include metros, trams, buses, as well as commuter and regional trains, all accessible with the same ticket. And this integration has its advantages when hosting large international events. Germany has hosted the World Cup back in 2006 and more recently the European Football Championships in 2024. For the 2024 tournament, ticket holders were given a free 36-hour pass to take all local transit within that game's integrated regional network. On top of that, Deutsche Bahn offered a special ticket for national train travel, where ticket holders could buy train tickets for the fixed price of €29.90. But this was only possible because Germany embodies the fundamental understanding that public transit is a public service, just like roads and utilities. And Germany is not alone, as this is the standard understanding in Europe. With a few exceptions, Europe does not have the Triple F problem. Unified networks overcome fragmentation. Proper investment from state and local governments overcome funding, and the function is embedded in the understanding that transportation is a service for the good of the public. To make myself clear, I do not think that New Jersey should foot the entire bill when it comes to transportation costs. After all, the World Cup is an international event and the majority of riders will be coming over from New York City. But New Jersey Transit is functionally isolated and beholden to a double standard when it comes to fiscal policy, one that does not seem to exist for roads. And in trying to solve this artificial problem, it ends up creating a new one. But if people and politicians uphold the archaic belief that public transit should be profit-oriented, it will not solve the overarching problem. I refuse to believe that in the richest country in human history, we can't afford to invest into our once great public transit system. We afforded 11 years of Iraq. We afforded 20 years of Afghanistan. We can afford to run our trains. To end the video, I'd like to say this. If we are so obsessed with competing with China, why not compete with them where it really matters? Let's build a national high-speed rail network that crisscrosses the country. Let's invest in our subways, and let's break free from car dependency and achieve the freedom to choose how we travel. Here's to hoping that in the foreseeable future, a free local train ticket to a major international event in the United States will be a no-brainer. Thanks for watching.